Hi guys, it's Mr. Gonzalez again, here with Lesson 6, Note Values. The main objective of this lesson is to understand the different note values as well as stem directions. While the placement of notes on the staff indicates the pitch, the duration of the note, or how long the note is held, is determined by the note value. A whole note is drawn as an open oval, like this. Two half notes equal the duration of one whole note. For our half notes, you have an open note head with a stem. Four quarter notes equal the duration of one whole note. Our quarter notes have a darkened note head and a stem. As I just mentioned, four quarter notes have the same duration as one whole note, and two half notes have the same duration as one whole note. We can deduce that two quarter notes have the same duration as one half note. Stems extend downward on the left side when the notes appear on or above the third line of the staff. So whether you have a quarter note or a half note, if it's on the third line or above, the stems will face down on the left, no matter what clef you are in. Stems extend upward on the right side when the note appears below the third line of the staff. As we see here, if it's below that third line, our stems will be on the right side facing up. The stem length should continue to the space or line with the same letter name above or below. Let's say we're in the treble clef. This is an F. The stem extends all the way to the top line. If you remember, you have every good boy does fine. So the F extends to the next F. And then if you have the F note here, the stem will extend all the way down to the next F, which is the first space. Let's take a look at some exercises. For our first exercise, we are going to draw the stems in the correct direction with the correct length. Let's get started. For our first note, we see it is below the third line. And we know if a note is below the third line, the stem will face up on the right. Next, we see a note on the fourth line. If a note is above the third line, the stem will face down on the left. Next, we have a note on the third line. If a note is on or above the third line, the stem will face down on the left. The second to last note that we have is on the third space. Since it's above the third line, again, we'll have a stem facing down on the left. And then for our last treble clef note, we have a note on the second line. Since it's below the third line, we have a stem facing up on the right. Now let's focus on the bass clef. We see we have a note below the third line, so our stem will face up on the right. Now we have a note on the third line. We know if we have a note on the third line, the stem will face down on the left. We have a note on the third space, so our stem will face down on the left. Now we have a note on the fourth line. Again, we'll have a stem facing down on the left. With our second to last bass clef note, we see a note on the second line, so we will add a stem on the right facing up. And for our last bass clef note, we see a note on the first space, so our stem will face up on the right. For our last exercise, I have already written the treble clef and bass clef for us. We will write the indicated notes only using notes on the staff. Let's get going. Let's start with the treble clef. We need to put a whole note on C. We know we have a C on the third space. Next, we need a quarter note on A. So, on our second space, we can put our quarter note and our stem will face up. Next, we have an E as a half note. So we have two locations. I will use the first line of the treble clef staff as our first E. Next, we have an F as a whole note. We have two locations again. We have the first space and the fifth line. I will use the fifth line. Next, we have a quarter note B. So on our third line, we have B, and our stem will be facing down. Next, we have a quarter note D. On our fourth line, we will have our D with our stem facing down. And then last, we have a half note G. Since it's on the second line, our stem will face up. Now, let's focus on our bass clef. We need an E half note. So if we remember our sentence, the all cows eat grass, we have an E on the third space with the stem facing down. Next, we need a D quarter note. Well, one line below the E, we have our D on the third line. Our stem will face down. Next, we need a whole note A. We have two locations, but I will use the space location for A. Next, we have a quarter note C. We can use all cows eat grass again and put our C on the second space. Now we need a half note F. If you remember, the bass clef shows us where F is, and we will have an F on the fourth line with our stem facing down. Next, we need a whole note B. We only have one B on the staff, and that's on the second line. And lastly, a half note G. We have two G's, but I will use the first G on the first line. You may have noticed that some of my notes do not match up with their counterpart. That's because the program I use is limited, and I cannot control certain aspects of it. But when you draw your notes, please make sure to write them above the correct identification. So if it says half note E, please make sure you put your half note E in the correct spot. Well, that's it for today's lesson, guys. I hope you feel more confident in your ability to identify whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, and your ability to identify stem directions. In our next lesson, we will be talking about measures, bar lines, and double bar lines.